I'd like to spend a few minutes now talking about Muslim contributions to science. To understand this, we have to grasp something of the mentality of the early Muslims. One of the most extraordinary features of them was their flexibility. I've mentioned that not only did they conquer the world, basically, but they were very happy to become a great maritime power, something that was not part of their culture in Mecca and Medina. And another extraordinary feature of their mentality was their very lively intellectual curiosity and the openness of many of them to learning from other cultures. And this was particularly prominent in the case of other cultures which had dimensions which didn't seem to be explicitly religious or to conflict with the Quranic worldview. There are many examples of this, but the most conspicuous and famous one is, of course, the openness that they showed towards aspects of the Greek cultural legacy. Not just philosophy, the most famous case, but also science. So already in the 8th century, we find classical Greek works being translated into Arabic, usually through the medium of Syriac, and very often in the early period it was Syriac Christian translators who were being commissioned by the caliphs to do this. But this activity, which I think should be regarded as one of the great deliberate attempts to be open to another civilization, it's a very almost a unique example of deliberate importation of ideas and attitudes from outside, rather than their gradual percolation. This process really took off with an Abbasid caliph called al-Ma'mun. Let me expunge this. Ma'mun was one of the great early Abbasid caliphs. You may recall I mentioned his support for the Mu'tazilite theology. And his dates are dates in which he reigned. Ma'mun, very fascinated by theological questions, also increasingly interested in the possibilities for Muslim theology of, is that legible? Of learning from the Greeks. Greek ideas had started to percolate particularly into Mu'tazilite thought, hence his interest. And he decides to do this officially by actually founding an academy primarily for the translation of Greek and to a lesser extent Syriac works into Arabic, so that these could be part of the general patrimony of Arab Islam. And this academy he called Baitul Hikmah, which means the house of wisdom. And it had a gigantic library, we're told over 100,000 volumes. Remember, this is at a time when the largest library in Europe, which was in Paris, perhaps contained just 400 books. So he had this gigantic library, different languages, and he also employed full-time scholars to teach there and also to carry out these translations. And the best known of these early translators was actually a Syriac Christian by the name of Hunayn ibn Ishaq. This is in Baghdad, yes. Center of the world. The Christians tended to lead the field in the Arab East, at least for the first 100 years of this process, because very often they were of Syriac background and hence could translate the Syriac books, and it was easy for them to learn Arabic as well, Syriac being a Semitic language. And also the fact that Hunayn bin Ishaq was a Christian enabled him to travel around the Byzantine Empire, where he assiduously used the caliph's funds to purchase manuscripts of ancient Greek texts. Back in Baghdad, Hunayn bin Ishaq got busy and translated, first of all, the medical works of Hippocrates and Galen. Galen was particularly important in the medieval Islamic world, far more important than he ever became in Europe. In fact, there are 3 times as many Arabic translations of Galen than there are Latin translations. He goes on to show more interest in philosophy, and he translates the key texts of Plato. So the Arabs for the first time have access to have access to Plato's Republic, Plato's Laws, and the Timaeus. And he also goes on to translate at least the logical works of Aristotle, the Organon. Now, of this great literature, two fields seem to be of most immediate importance to the Muslims as they saw this burgeoning corpus of knowledge in their midst. Medicine and astronomy. Medicine, as a perennially popular practical science, unlike many of the Greek sciences, it actually had a career at the end of it, so plenty of people started to study medicine. And also astronomy. And one of the great reasons why astronomy became such a respected and widely cultivated science in the medieval Islamic world was, of course, because of the astronomical problems involved in the Muslim religion itself. First of all, how you figure out the times of the prayers, and more taxingly, how you determine exactly the orientation of the city of Mecca. If you're in a remote and unfamiliar place, how on earth do you do it? Well, to do it properly, you need to get into things like spherical trigonometry and all kinds of fairly advanced geometrical tasks. So we find astronomy, and particularly its associated mathematical disciplines, very assiduously cultivated by the early Muslims. And in fact, the first Muslim books which make extensive use of the Hellenistic legacy are books on mathematics. Now, the great pioneer of Muslim maths was the great genius al-Khwarizmi, one of the many drawbacks of computer use is that your handwriting degenerates, but if you can't read these things, let me know. Al-Khwarizmi, Khwarazm, where he came from, is that area of Uzbekistan on the southern coast of the Aral Sea. He came to Baghdad, and he seems to have died around about the middle of the 9th century. We don't have an exact date for it. He was one of the scholars working at this place called Baitul Hikmah. And the Caliph asked him to produce a revised and more accurate set of astronomical tables. Hitherto, the tables of Ptolemy had continued in use. And also asked him to update Ptolemy's work on geography. And he does this, and does it very well, and in due season these works are widely accepted in Europe as well. But his most important legacy is the very radical advances he made in the field of algebra. In fact, the very word algebra, as is so often the case with words with the letters AL at the beginning, comes after the great work he wrote called al-Jabr, which means something rather vaguely like equivalence or compulsion or necessary relations, that kind of thing. And he was able to do this because he was one of the first to use modern-style decimal notation, i.e. the use of base 10 and the so-called Arabic numerals. It's a strange thing that although the Arabic numerals were called by the Arabs the Indian numerals, scholars don't have any definitive evidence to suggest that this represents direct influence from India. It remains hypothetical. And this, of course, was a huge advance because the Romans had used the, in many ways, quite clumsy Roman numerals with the X's and V's and so forth, which, as soon as you get into advanced mathematics, become something of a nightmare. And the Byzantines, even more perversely, used base 16 hexadecimal system as the basis for their mathematical system, and of course also used in administration. All of these did not just have abstract applications, but they also had very immediate implications for the way in which your bureaucracy operated, the way in which you kept accounts, the way in which you did business, and so forth. Another important Arab mathematician also associated with this Baitul Hikmah was a certain Jabir ibn Aflah, known in the West as Geber, G-E-B-E-R, and he really is the great early pioneer of spherical trigonometry, which, as you'll recall, is this important discipline for figuring out the direction of Mecca, but which has other advantages as well. Also influential was somebody called Ibn al-Haytham, known because the Latins had understandable difficulty getting their mouth muscles around the Arabic syllables, known to the West as al-Hasan. If this was more or less inevitable, because if you wanted to use these words in a Latin sentence, you had to put suffixes and so forth on. So they tended to shorten and Latinize all of these names. Did you have a question?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I got to go back a couple.
Mm-hmm.
For these mathematicians, you said that there were, base 16 different bases. When you go back to Muhammad's time, when they figured out zakat at I don't know, I guess as soon as it was 2.5, I don't know how that number came about. How did they figure that out? Did they have a base system there?
The classical hadith for it says, in every 40 sheep, 1 sheep. That's the way they did it, as a fraction, rather than as a percentage.
Do you know if they had a base 10 system?
I'm sure they didn't. No, perhaps somebody else here could illuminate this, but as far as I know, it wasn't known in the Prophet's time.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
How do you spell the gentleman's name who did the spherical trigonometry?
Right. He's called... I've been trying to spare you some of the names of the lesser figures. Invariably, as soon as I'm away from my notes, I forget them myself. But he's called Jabir ibn Aflah, and known in the West as Geber. I assume that's how they pronounced it.
Songs were looking at names, and one thing I read was that name al-Khwarizmi is the root of our word algorithm.
Yeah.
As well.
Very much a relevant mathematical maneuver, of course. Algorithms are the basis of computer programming. Now this Ibn al-Haytham character, he writes more than 50 books. At least more than 50 of them have survived. It's possible that he composed more. And the best known of these, again at the risk of overburdening you with these terms, really a hugely influential work, was known as the Kitāb al-Manāẓir, which you could translate legitimately as the Book of Optics. Optics. The Latins called it Opticae Thesaurus, comprehensive book about optic matters. And he's very original in this book, and he goes more or less completely against the very revered authorities of Ptolemy and Euclid. The most radical thing he says in this book is that light rays do not move from the eye to the object, as everybody had hitherto assumed, but come from the object to the eye. And he demonstrated this in many quite ingenious ways. He was the first to do experiments with things like parabolic mirrors, for instance. He did things with lenses and so on. He also deduced the general laws which govern the refraction of light through a transparent medium, whether it be a gas or through water. So he's the first person ever to have calculated the thickness of the Earth's atmosphere. Of course, you can't actually calculate the thickness of the Earth's atmosphere because it doesn't suddenly stop and beyond you just have the vacuum. But the fact that he thought he could do that and that he used the correct principle, which is measuring the way in which the sun's rays are refracted through it, shows the originality of his thought. Now, obviously, Ibn al-Haytham's discoveries were a very considerable application in the sphere of astronomy. The Arabs, again, making the most of their geographical position, had access to both the Greek and the Indian astronomical traditions. So they translated books not just from Greek, but also from Sanskrit, and also some books from Pahlavi, which was the pre-Islamic language of Iran. And they soon go on to make their own contributions. So we find that the Arabic version of Ptolemy, amended and improved by a number of scholars, becomes known as the Almagest. And this immediately makes the journey over the frontier into Europe and becomes really the basis for astronomy right up to the time of Copernicus. The astronomers were also interested in what they called the Zij, that's Z-I-J, which are astronomical tables. And the best known of these was assembled by a man called al-Battani in about 900. And it's interesting that so accurate and satisfying were these tables that they were used in the Royal Astronomy, the Royal Observatory at Greenwich in England as late as 1749. So they have a career of about 800 years. They're not surpassed in that period. So that's astronomy. I want to talk a little bit more about medicine now, because if anything, the Arab contribution to medicine was even more fundamental than it had been to these other disciplines. The Middle East, before the arrival of Islam, was already a major center of medical practice and research through various teaching hospitals, and these tended to be staffed and operated by Nestorian Christians. The best known of them was at a city to the east of Baghdad called Gondishapur, which remained a significant center for about 200 years into the Islamic period. And in fact, for the first 200 years of Islam, Nestorian physicians tend to be the best known. And a Nestorian Christian from Gondishapur called Ibn Battuta, I'll write it up if you want, but it's not centrally important. He moves to Baghdad in about 800, hoping for caliphal patronage. And with cash from the caliph, he opens the capital's first medical academy. This is under the caliph Harun al-Rashid, probably the best known of them all. And this immediately establishes one of the most consistent cultural patterns and phenomena of classical Islam, namely the rich and the wealthy competing with each other, both to buy prestige in the eyes of the world and also to curry favor with God by endowing hospitals and teaching academies. One of the most recurrent and characteristic features of a medieval Muslim city is the bimaristan, or the hospital. I mentioned incidentally already on Monday the use of music therapy in some medieval Muslim hospitals in the treatment of medical disorders. But that was only part of a much wider system which very often provided free treatment. And to understand how this was possible, not possible in some countries even today, of course, was a system known as the awqaf. Is this a familiar word? Waqf, awqaf. Something that should be known. I'll give you the singular of it only. Perhaps slightly easier. Waqf is roughly the equivalent, well, the nearest thing to it in European law is the thing called mutmain, which means a charitable endowment in perpetuity, an inalienable endowment. And what this meant simply was that some wealthy pasha or amir would have 1 million dinars or so spare, and he would sign a document in which this money was made over in perpetuity for the support of a particular establishment. And generally the ruling of Islamic law was that the money itself had to be invested in a physical phenomenon, so that land would become the endowment of a particular mosque or college or hospital or whatever, or shops. So you'll see sometimes in some Muslim cities that a mosque is actually built over a row of shops, and that's because both were constructed by a particular patron, and the shops are simply there to provide income for the maintenance and upkeep of the mosque. So this institution, one of the most characteristic in medieval Islamic societies, it's been estimated that by the close of the Ottoman period, around 40% of land in the city of Istanbul was actually held by these charitable foundations. An enormously important institution, and one that did make possible free education for those who wanted it, and also made possible these great hospitals. It's interesting to remark that the world's oldest continually functioning eye hospital is the Waqf of a Mamluk sultan in Cairo called Sultan Qalawun, who was, I think, 13th century. And I've actually visited it, and it's next to his mausoleum, next to his mosque, and it's been functioning, treating eye diseases for the best part of 800 years. But just to give you an idea of the scale of operations which were made possible by this system, there was also in Cairo one, almost certainly the world's biggest hospital, called al-Mansoori. And this could accommodate, we are told, 8,000 patients. And it had many of the features of a modern hospital. Male and female patients were separated, and there were separate wards for separate disorders. Particular diseases would be confined to different wards, which has obvious advantages. There would be a ward for surgical cases, a ward for mental diseases, and so forth. The hospital had resident surgeons and physicians, also had nurses of both sexes. It had a separate dispensary, administrative section, storerooms, library, a lecture room, and a mosque. So that, unfortunately, one of the inevitable concomitants of medical care seems to be the creation of bureaucracies, and medieval Islam was no exception. So one minor branch of medieval Arabic literature is a genre of books about hospital management. But this was just the institutional framework. Medical theory itself also made great steps forward. And in due course, it utterly revolutionized the teaching and understanding of medicine in Europe as well. A kind of medical canon was created which included some 70 classical authors, mostly Muslims, but also including some Christian and Jewish physicians. And this canon was translated in due course into Latin, either directly or through the medium of Hebrew. The Jews, of course, in the Middle Ages being also known for their work as physicians. There are two people who become particularly well known, two great towering figures. One of them is Razi. I'll venture not to write his name up because it should be easy. R-A-Z-I. R-A-Z-I in this part of the world. He had, again, a Latin name, whether he knew it or not. Rhazes, which they thought was easier to pronounce than Razi. He wrote a lot of books, including some less-known ones, which indicate, again, some of the timeless features of the medical field. He has a book, for instance, called Why Frightened Patients Forsake Even the Skilled Physicians. And he has another one, which also exists in the manuscript libraries, of which he called Why People Prefer Quacks and Charlatans to Skilled Physicians. A number of sort of reflective books. Yeah, as I say, some things don't change. But most famously, he writes this truly tremendous book called al-Hawi, which becomes known in Europe as continens, which more or less means al-Hawi, that which is inclusive, a comprehensive manual on medicine. Gigantic multi-volume work which includes everything he knew about the medicine, not just of the Arabs, but also of the Indians and the Greeks and so forth. So he proceeds chapter by chapter, and in each chapter he says what the Greeks have said about this disease, what the Indians have said about this disease, what the Persians have said, what the Syrians have said, and so forth. And at the end of these conclusions, he adds his own clinical observations based on his own practice as a doctor, and then gives his own opinion. This book was abbreviated and achieved very wide currency also in Europe under the name of Liber Regius. This was the textbook that they used. Again, becoming subliterate here. They used it in our own hospital in Cambridge at Addenbrooke's well into the 17th century. Razi's only serious rival as a physician was, of course, the possibly even more towering figure of Ibn-Sina. Dies in 1037. Again, he has a sobriquet in the West. The great Avicenna, a Sheikh Ra'is, the great supreme master of this and of course of other disciplines. He was also a significant philosopher, and his main contribution to medicine was another gigantic book called Al-Qanun, known in the West as the Canon of Avicenna. Translated into Latin in the 12th century, completely dominates medical teaching in Europe until at least the late 16th century. There are even cases of it being used in the 18th century in some hospitals in France. So popular is it that in the 16th century alone, 20 different editions of the book are printed in Italy, all in Latin. And there are also endless, innumerable commentaries on this book. Another great physician, this time from Spain, was a man called al-Zahrawi. Zahrawi's claim to fame lies in his great innovative skills in designing new medical instruments. In fact, if you go to the new Museum of Arab Civilization in Cordoba, they've actually recreated some of his instruments from the very detailed illustrations that he gives in his manual. So the Arabs also become great exponents of the science of surgery. Other sciences, alchemy, of course, the very word alchemy is of obviously Arab origin. Alchemy in the medieval Islamic world, as in Europe, had two dimensions. First of all, the mystical, speculative dimension, the metaphor transmuting base metal into gold, which was seen as being a symbol for the transformation of the soul into something pure and incorruptible. And also the practical aspect of alchemy. One of the things that Arabs did was, and this was largely the achievement of Ibn-Sina, was to more or less discredit the notion of the transmutation of elements. They said one element simply cannot become another element. These are fundamental building blocks of existence, and you can't turn one into another. We also find some of these people writing on botany. Perhaps the best known writer amongst the Arabs on botany was a certain Ibn al-Baytar, another Spaniard. He's from Malaga, quite late, I think 13th century. His name is said to be the origin of the word veterinary, because he writes about the treatment of animals. Now, all of these thinkers form part of what I've described as probably the greatest single process of cultural osmosis in history. A twofold process. First of all, the enthusiasm of the Arabs for the old sciences of the Greeks. Then they pick this thing up and they run with it for a while, and then the Europeans take it, and a second process of transmutation begins. Now, of course, from the Eastern or Islamic perspective, that's not the primary function of this process. These things continue to be developed within the Islamic world, and sometimes there's an excessive emphasis in Western texts on this period, on the relevance of, on the role of the Arabs as a kind of bridge, as a mediator. The works of Aristotle, Plato and so forth, largely been lost in medieval Europe, and the Arabs came along and they handed them over intact to the Latins. Of course, as I've tried to demonstrate, the Arabs did a good deal more than that. They actually completely revolutionized most of these disciplines, and even after the Europeans had picked them up, they continued to be cultivated in the Muslim world. But what's clear is that it was Muslim thought that kick-started medieval European Christian thought in all of these disciplines. It was Muslim thought that brought Europe out of the Dark Ages and provided the foundations, many of the details, as I'll explain in due course, of Catholic scholastic theology, ultimately opening the way to the Renaissance.